In this video, I'm going to cover the very basics of polymers. Before we get into polymers, we first need to talk about the four most common elements that are found in living things. Because when we start talking about the polymers of life, you'll notice that they're made up of these elements. The first one is oxygen. Oxygen makes up about 65% of our bodies. So it is the most important. Carbon is the next, makes up about 18% of our body. Hydrogen makes up about 10%, and nitrogen makes up about 3%. The rest of the 100% is made up of other elements, but these four are the most common. Now, there are a couple of vocabulary words that you might not hear a lot in this class, but you will in other classes. Now, we have something called organic molecules. These are molecules that contain carbon. So if there is any carbon in that molecule, it is classified as organic. You might have heard the term organic material. Whenever you hear that term, it usually refers to some sort of living material that might either be still alive or decaying. Okay, so organic, we are made up of a lot of carbon, so therefore we are made up of organic material. Inorganic molecules are going to be anything then that does not contain carbon. So on the screen I have a picture of two different categories, right? We have organic molecules, and you'll notice that all of those contain carbon. And we have inorganic molecules, and you'll notice that none of those contain carbon, okay? Organic contains carbon, inorganic does not. Now, another thing to know before we get into the actual polymers of life is that carbon, which is a very common element, really likes to bond to itself. It likes to form these long chains of itself, and then it really likes to then bond onto hydrogens as well. Now, the term that we use to describe these molecules that are made up of a bunch of carbons and hydrogens is hydrocarbons. You can see the terms hydrogen and carbon kind of within this one term. Hydro is referring to the hydrogens, and carbons is obviously referring to the carbon. So whenever we're going to reference this term again in the future, hydrocarbons are just long chains of carbons with a bunch of hydrogens attached. Now, since we're talking about polymers of life, we might as well talk about what a polymer is, right? A synonym for polymer, which you might have heard of in the past, is a macromolecule, also abbreviated as macro. If you've ever heard of counting your macros or eating your macros, that is referring to these polymers that we are going to talk about. The definition of a polymer is a long chain of repeating units. And those repeating units have a name, and that is monomer. So the definition then of a monomer, you can probably guess, are the small units that make up larger molecules, and another term for those larger molecules is a polymer. So for instance, on the screen, right, we have all these black dots. Those are your monomers. If we were to put a bunch of those together to make one long chain of them, that long chain would be called a polymer. So we are going to be talking about four polymers, or four long chains of repeating units that are essential for life. Now, our body is constantly building these polymers. Since we need them to live, we have to continuously build them. And the process of building polymers is called a dehydration reaction. And if we look at the word dehydration, you might just automatically think that means that you don't have enough water, right? When you're dehydrated, that means you haven't been drinking water. Dehydration exactly means that, but it more specifically breaks down to the removal of water. D, that prefix D, means removal, and the hydro, or the hydra in this case, is water. So dehydration reaction is a reaction that results from the removal of water. So a dehydration reaction is going to build a polymer, or in other words, it is going to add a bunch of monomers together, okay? Means the same thing. If you're putting monomers together, that means you're building a polymer, okay? And in the process of putting these monomers together, each time you add another monomer, water is going to be released. So you can see in this diagram here, we have a growing chain. Each of these purple circles is a monomer. If we try and add another monomer to the chain, in order to do so, we have to release one molecule of water. Okay, so in order to build a polymer, we have to also then release water. And that's why they call it a dehydration reaction. Now, our body also has to be able to break down polymers. We get our polymers from what we eat. And you know that once you eat, your digestive system works to break that food down. The reason we have to break that food down is to get the polymers out of the food, break them apart, and then rebuild them in a form that our body can use. So the process of breaking the polymers is the very opposite of what it was to build the polymers. Okay, so it's the opposite of a dehydration reaction. The process is called hydrolysis. Hydro means water, and lysis means to break down. So hydrolysis is using water to break something down. So hydrolysis involves water molecules being added. And then when those water molecules are added, it is going to break the polymer apart into its monomers. So I'm going to flip back and forth between this slide and the last slide so you can see that the diagrams for dehydration reaction and hydrolysis are literally the same, but flipped, okay? So in hydrolysis, we're starting with a polymer here. Each of the purple circles is a monomer. So we have a polymer, and we are going to add water in order to break that polymer apart. That's hydrolysis. If I go back to dehydration reaction, it's literally the opposite. I have a monomer that I want to attach to other monomers. If I do that, I will lose a molecule of water in order to form a polymer. Okay, so we're starting with monomers. We are losing water to form a polymer. Hydrolysis, we have a polymer. We're going to add water in order to get monomers out. They are literally the reverse of each other. They're each other backwards, okay? And that is going to be it for Polymer Basics.